What if I told you that the person you walk past every day without noticing could teach you more about wealth than every business school combined? Have you ever looked down on someone because of their job, only to discover they were playing a completely different game than you? Maybe it was a janitor who owned 3 rental properties, or the cashier who'd been quietly investing for decades while you were still figuring out your 401k. This billionaire CEO thought he knew everything about money, until his cleaning lady showed him he was dead broke in the ways that actually matter. But here's the shocking part. She was worth more than him, and it had nothing to do with her bank account. Meet Richard Langston. Net worth, $3.2 billion. CEO and founder of Langston Innovations, a tech empire that revolutionized artificial intelligence. Private jets, multiple mansions, cars worth more than most people's houses. By every metric society uses to measure success, Richard had won the game. Yet every night, Richard stood in his 42nd floor penthouse overlooking Manhattan, feeling completely hollow. All that money, but he was spiritually and emotionally bankrupt. He could buy anything except the one thing he desperately needed: connection, purpose, meaning. While Richard was drowning in his golden prison, there was a woman who cleaned his office floors every evening. Grace Thompson, 53 years old, wore the same faded uniform, pushed the same cart through those gleaming corporate hallways. To the executives rushing past her, she was furniture, background noise, invisible. But Grace Thompson held a secret that would shatter everything Richard believed about wealth. She wasn't just changing the trash bags in his conference room. She was changing entire communities. While Richard was counting his billions, Grace was building something far more valuable, something that would make Richard question whether he was actually the poor one. Grace had discovered the real secret to wealth, and it had nothing to do with accumulation. She understood something that all of Richard's Harvard MBAs and financial advisors had missed completely. If you ever felt like success is leaving you empty, smash that like button, because this story is about to flip everything you think you know about wealth upside down. This isn't just another feel-good story about rich people learning lessons. This is about two people from completely different worlds who discovered that everything they thought they knew about money was wrong. And what happened when they joined forces changed not just their lives, but thousands of others. So buckle up, because you're about to meet the cleaning lady who was secretly wealthier than her billionaire boss, and discover exactly what that means for your own relationship with money and success. Let me take you inside Richard Langston's typical Tuesday morning. 5:30 a.m. alarm in his $15 million penthouse. The personal trainer arrives at 6 sharp. By 7:15, he's showered and dressed in a $3,000 Italian suit, reviewing quarterly projections over coffee that costs more per cup than most people spend on groceries in a week. His driver picks him up in a Bentley that glides through Manhattan traffic like butter. 20 minutes later, Richard steps into his corporate headquarters. 60 floors of steel and glass that pierce New York's skyline like a gleaming sword. The elevator whisks him to the top floor, where his corner office spans half the building's width. Board meetings fill his morning. Acquisition deals worth hundreds of millions get discussed over catered lunches. Private jet flights to close deals in Silicon Valley happen on Wednesday afternoons like most people grab coffee with friends. By any external measure, Richard Langston was living the American dream on steroids. But here's what those quarterly reports couldn't capture. Richard felt like he was suffocating. Every morning, he'd wake up with the same question gnawing at him. Is this it? $3 billion in the bank. And he felt poorer than he'd ever felt in his life. Money had become his scoreboard, not his tool. He measured every day by how many millions he'd gained or lost, not by whether he'd actually accomplished anything meaningful. Richard's relationship with wealth was like an addiction. More deals meant more money. More money meant more respect. More respect meant more deals. The cycle never ended, and it never satisfied. He was running faster and faster on a treadmill that went nowhere. You know that feeling when you achieve everything you thought you wanted, but still feel empty inside? That hollowness that creeps in during quiet moments when the applause dies down and you're left alone with your thoughts? Richard knew that feeling intimately. His marriage had crumbled 3 years earlier. Margaret couldn't compete with his first love, the business. She'd begged him to take vacations, to be present at their anniversary dinners, to remember their conversations about starting a family. But Richard was always consumed by the next big deal, the next milestone, the next billion. "You're married to your money, not to me," she'd said during their final fight. She wasn't wrong. His relationship with his parents had withered to obligatory holiday phone calls. His father, a retired mechanic from Ohio, couldn't relate to Richard's world of private equity and hostile takeovers. His mother still sent him birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside, not understanding that her son could buy small countries. His brother Marcus had stopped returning his calls 2 years ago after Richard missed his nephew's graduation because of a merger meeting. "You have everything except what matters," Marcus had texted him. The message still sat in Richard's phone, undelete but unanswered. The cruel irony was that Richard was surrounded by people all day long. Board members, executives, assistants, lawyers, consultants. His calendar was packed with human interaction. Yet he felt more isolated than a hermit on a mountaintop. These people needed Richard for his money, his connections, his signature on contracts. But none of them knew him. None of them cared whether he was happy or fulfilled, or whether he lay awake at night wondering if he was wasting his life. Richard had enough money to buy companionship, but he couldn't purchase genuine connection. He could afford any luxury except the one thing he craved most, meaning. Fast forward to a Thursday evening in October. Richard was preparing for the biggest acquisition in his company's history, a $2.8 billion deal that would cement Langston Innovations as a dominant force in AI technology. The presentation was scheduled for Friday morning, and everything had to be perfect. The office was mostly empty by 9 p.m., but Richard remained hunched over his laptop in the conference room, fine-tuning slides and rehearsing his pitch to potential investors. This deal would add another billion to his net worth and make international headlines. As he worked, Richard became aware of subtle sounds drifting through the office. The quiet hum of a vacuum cleaner, gentle footsteps in the hallway, the soft rustle of papers being organized. Someone was cleaning the offices while he worked late. For years, Richard had been vaguely aware that cleaning staff worked in the building after hours, but he'd never paid attention to them. They were part of the invisible infrastructure that kept his world running smoothly, like the heating system or the security cameras. But tonight, something made him pause. Maybe it was a loneliness weighing on him, or maybe it was simple curiosity. He stood up from his laptop and walked toward the sound. What Richard discovered in the next few minutes would completely shatter his understanding of wealth, success, and what it truly means to be rich. The woman pushing that cleaning cart was about to teach a billionaire CEO the most valuable lesson of his life, one that would transform not just his perspective, but the lives of thousands of people he'd never even met. Grace Thompson's story began 40 miles outside of Cleveland, Ohio, in a small town where the biggest employer was a factory that made auto parts. Her childhood home was a 2-bedroom rental where the heat got shut off every winter when her mother couldn't make the utility payments. Grace's mother, Linda, was a force of nature packed into a 5'2" frame. She worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day, and babysitting neighborhood kids on weekends. Linda never complained, never made excuses, and never let Grace see her cry, though Grace sometimes heard the muffled sobs through thin bedroom walls after the bills came in. "Education is your ticket out of here," Linda would tell Grace every morning before school. "But hard work is your vehicle to get there." Grace watched her mother juggle those 3 jobs with the precision of a circus performer. Linda would rush in the grocery store to pick up Grace from school, help with homework while dinner cooked, then head out to clean offices until midnight. She'd be back up at 5 a.m. to do it all over again. By age 12, Grace was doing her own laundry and cooking simple meals. Not because her mother was neglectful, but because Linda was building something, a college fund hidden in a coffee behind canned vegetables in their kitchen cabinet. $20 here, $50 there, whatever Linda could scrape together from her multiple paychecks. Maybe you know someone like Grace, working multiple jobs, invisible to most people, but with an unbreakable spirit that refuses to accept that circumstances define destiny. After high school, Grace earned a partial scholarship to a community college, but had to drop out after her mother was diagnosed with diabetes and couldn't work full-time anymore. Grace became the primary breadwinner at 19, taking on the same kind of multiple jobs her mother had worked. When Linda passed away 5 years later, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She sold their small house, packed her belongings into a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and drove straight to New York City with $3,200 in savings and her mother's advice echoing in her mind. Hard work is your vehicle. Grace arrived in Manhattan with no connections, no job prospects, and no safety net. She rented a studio apartment in Queens that was smaller than most people's walk-in closets and started applying for every job she could find. When Langston Innovations opened their headquarters in 2014, Grace was among the first cleaning staff hired. The pay was decent, the benefits were solid, and the work was honest. She showed up every day at 6 p.m. sharp, finished every task with meticulous attention to detail, and never called in sick. While other cleaning staff complained about the demanding executives who left messes in conference rooms or the long hours required during busy seasons, Grace approached her work differently. She saw each task as an opportunity to learn something new. She listened to boardroom conversations while vacuuming nearby offices, picking up terminology and business concepts. She studied the financial newspapers left behind in conference rooms, teaching herself about markets and investments. When executives discarded business books after reading them, Grace would rescue them from the trash and devour every page during her lunch breaks. Grace understood something that escaped most people. While others saw her as just a cleaning lady, she saw opportunity everywhere. Every overheard conversation was a free business lesson. Every discarded annual report was a masterclass in corporate strategy. Every late night in those offices was graduate-level education in how successful people think and operate. For 10 years, Grace remained nearly invisible to the executives rushing past her in the hallways. They would step around her cart without making eye contact, take conference calls while she cleaned around them, and discuss million-dollar deals as if she wasn't in the room. But Grace was absorbing everything. She maintained a positive attitude that surprised her coworkers. When they complained about being ignored or disrespected, Grace would simply smile and say, "They're teaching me more than they realize." Her supervisor, Maria, once asked Grace how she stayed so upbeat despite the way some executives treated the cleaning staff. Grace replied, "I'm not here to be seen. I'm here to see." There's a difference. Before I reveal what Richard discovered about Grace, let me ask you, have you ever underestimated someone because of their job title? Drop a comment below because this next part will blow your mind. What none of those rushing executives knew was that Grace Thompson had been building something extraordinary during her decade of apparent invisibility. Every Tuesday evening, Grace volunteered at the East Side Community Center, teaching financial literacy classes to single mothers and young adults. She developed a curriculum based on everything she'd learned from those discarded business books and overheard conversations. Her students called her sessions Grace's Money Wisdom Wednesdays, though they happened on Tuesdays. Grace taught them about compound interest using grocery shopping examples. She explained stock market basics by comparing investments to planting seeds in the garden. She showed them how to budget using the same principles she'd learned watching her mother manage 3 jobs and a household. Every Thursday night, Grace studied. She'd enrolled in online courses on investment strategy, real estate, and personal finance. While Richard Langston was attending Harvard Business School alumni events, Grace was earning certificates from community colleges and online universities, paying for each course with money saved from her cleaning salary. Every Saturday morning, Grace visited elderly residents in her Queens neighborhood, helping them manage their finances and avoid scams. She'd review their bills, explain their insurance benefits, and make sure they weren't being overcharged for services they didn't need. But Grace's most remarkable secret was what she'd been doing with her own money during those 10 years of careful observation and self-education. While she appeared to live modestly, same faded uniform, same reliable Honda Civic, same small Queens apartment, Grace had been quietly building something that would have impressed even executives who ignored her presence. She understood that wealth wasn't about appearance or status symbols. Wealth was about options, security, and the ability to help others build better lives. What Grace had built in secret was about to shock a billionaire CEO into questioning everything he thought he knew about money, success, and what it truly means to be rich. 3 weeks after that late Thursday night encounter, Richard found himself working late again. This time it was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November, and the acquisition deal had closed successfully. Richard should have been celebrating, but instead, he felt the familiar emptiness creeping back in. As he reviewed quarterly reports in the main conference room, he noticed Grace organizing a stack of marketing materials that had been left scattered across the table from an earlier presentation. Something made him look up from his laptop. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice cutting to the quiet office atmosphere. "I don't think we've ever been properly introduced. I'm Richard." Grace paused in her organizing, clearly surprised that the CEO was speaking to her directly. "Grace Thompson, Mr. Langston. I've been cleaning your offices for almost 10 years now." 10 years? Richard was genuinely shocked. He'd been walking past this woman for a decade without really seeing her. What started as polite small talk quickly evolved into something unexpected. Grace mentioned that she'd been reading about the company's new AI initiatives in the business section of the newspaper. Not just reading. She had thoughtful questions about the ethical implications of automation and job displacement. "I've been wondering," Grace said, carefully stacking papers, "whether companies like yours consider the human cost when they make entire job categories obsolete. Do you have programs to retrain workers whose positions get automated away?" Richard blinked. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected to have with his cleaning staff. "That's actually a really thoughtful question," he admitted. "Most of our board meetings focus on efficiency gains and cost savings. We don't spend much time discussing transition support for displaced workers." Grace smiled knowingly. Sometimes the people closest to the ground see problems that don't show up in quarterly reports. Over the next 20 minutes, Grace shared insights about sustainable business practices, community reinvestment, and the importance of corporate social responsibility. She spoke passionately about financial literacy programs she'd observed in other companies and questioned whether businesses had obligations beyond profit maximization. Richard found himself genuinely engaged in a way he hadn't experienced in months. This woman possessed a depth of understanding about business and social issues that rivaled many of his MBA-educated executives. More importantly, she seemed to care about the human element that his corporate world often ignored. "Where did you learn about all this?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "Books, mostly," Grace replied modestly, "and paying attention. You'd be surprised what you can learn by listening carefully." As Grace finished organizing the conference room and prepared to move to her next task, Richard felt an unfamiliar sensation. He wanted to continue this conversation. For the first time in years, he connected with someone who seemed to understand both business principles and human values. "Grace, would you be interested in having coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about corporate responsibility." Grace smiled. "I'd like that, Mr. Langston." But then Richard stumbled across something that would change his life forever. The following Sunday morning, Richard was reading the New York Times over breakfast when a headline in the Metro section caught his attention. "Local hero. Cleaning lady turns community around." Richard nearly choked on his coffee. The article featured a photograph of Grace Thompson, his Grace Thompson, standing in front of the East Side Community Center, surrounded by a group of smiling young adults holding certificates. Richard read the article 3 times, each reading more stunning than the last. Grace Thompson, 53, has quietly become one of Queens' most impactful community leaders, the article began. Working as a cleaning lady by day, Thompson has spent the last decade building a financial literacy empire that has transformed hundreds of lives in New York's underserved communities. The reporter detailed Grace's Tuesday evening classes, which had grown from 5 students in 2015 to over 200 students currently enrolled across 3 different community centers. The article included testimonials from former students who had used Grace's teachings to buy their first homes, start small businesses, and break cycles of financial instability. But the real shock came in the article's final paragraphs. "Thompson's impact extends far beyond education," the reporter wrote. "Through careful investing in real estate acquisitions, she has quietly amassed a substantial portfolio that she uses to fund scholarships and community development projects." Richard's hands were shaking as he continued reading. While Thompson declined to discuss specific numbers, sources close to her work estimate that she has personally funded over $2.8 million in scholarships over the past 8 years, helping more than 400 young adults attend college or trade schools. Richard immediately called his assistant and asked her to research everything she could find about Grace Thompson's financial activities. What she discovered left him speechless. Grace had been quietly building an investment portfolio that would have impressed Wall Street professionals. Starting with small amounts saved from her cleaning salary, she had systematically invested in index funds, dividend-paying stocks, and carefully selected real estate properties. Her real estate holdings alone were worth over $1.8 million. Grace owned 4 rental properties in Queens and Brooklyn, all purchased below market value and renovated using contractors from her community classes. The rental income from these properties funded her scholarship programs, while the properties themselves appreciated in value. Her stock portfolio showed the discipline of a seasoned investor. Grace had been dollar-cost averaging into broad market index funds for 15 years, never panic selling during market downturns, never chasing speculative investments. Her portfolio had grown to over $1.4 million through consistent contributions and compound growth. But here's the kicker. Grace had given away nearly as much as she had accumulated. While Richard measured success by how much wealth he could accumulate, Grace measured hers by how much impact she could create. She had systematically donated 40% of her investment gains to scholarship funds, emergency assistance programs, and small business loans for community members. Richard sat in his penthouse, staring at the research his assistant had compiled, trying to process what he was learning. His cleaning lady, the woman he'd walked past for 10 years without acknowledging, had built $1 million investment portfolio on a cleaning lady salary and was using it to transform her entire community. The numbers were staggering, but the human impact was even more remarkable. Grace had funded full college scholarships for 127 students over 8 years. She had provided emergency financial assistance to over 300 families facing eviction or medical crises. She had given small business loans to 89 entrepreneurs, with a repayment rate of 96%, better than most traditional banks. Her financial literacy programs had directly impacted over 2,000 people, with graduates reporting an average increase in personal savings of 340% within 2 years of completing her courses. Grace Thompson, earning $35,000 per year as a cleaning lady, had created more measurable positive impact in her community than Richard Langston had created with his $3.2 billion fortune. Richard's billion sat mostly idle, growing larger through passive investments but touching virtually no one's life in meaningful ways. He donated to charity for tax benefits, but had never personally engaged with the impact of his giving. He had never mentored anyone, never taught valuable skills to people who needed them, never used his wealth to create opportunities for others to build their own success. Grace's millions were working overtime, funding education, preventing homelessness, enabling entrepreneurship, and breaking generational cycles of financial struggle. Every dollar she'd earned was a soldier in her war against poverty and financial literacy. The cleaning lady was wealthier than the billionaire, and it had nothing to do with the numbers in their bank accounts. Richard finally understood what his brother Marcus had meant. You have everything except what matters. Grace Thompson had what mattered most: the ability to transform lives, including her own, through intentional and impactful use of financial resources. She had discovered the secret that all of Richard's Harvard Business School education had missed. True wealth multiplies when you give it away strategically. That realization would change everything. Richard spent that entire Sunday in his penthouse, pacing from room to room like a caged animal. The newspaper article lay spread across his marble coffee table, but he'd already memorized every word. The research about Grace's financial portfolio sat in neat stacks on his dining table, but the numbers weren't what kept him awake. It was a realization that he'd been playing the wrong game his entire adult life. For 30 years, Richard had been accumulating wealth like a hoarder collects possessions, endlessly, compulsively, without any deeper purpose than the accumulation itself. He'd measured his success by Forbes rankings and quarterly statements, by the size of his real estate holdings and the value of his stock options. Grace Thompson, making $35,000 per year, had accomplished more meaningful change in her community than Richard had accomplished with his $3.2 billion empire. Her millions were working soldiers in a war against poverty and ignorance. His billions were sitting in investment accounts, growing larger but touching no lives, solving no problems, creating no opportunities for anyone except himself. The comparison was devastating. Grace had built wealth to serve others. Richard had built wealth to serve his own ego. Grace's money multiplied impact. Richard's money just multiplied itself. He thought about his ex-wife Margaret's final words during their divorce. "You're married to your money, not to me." She'd been more right than she knew. Richard wasn't just married to his money. He was enslaved by it. Every decision he made was filtered through one question. Will this make me richer? Grace filtered her decisions through a completely different question. Will this make others' lives better? Have you ever had a moment where you realize you've been chasing the wrong things your entire life? That sickening feeling when you understand that everything you thought was important was actually meaningless, and everything you ignored was actually precious? Richard felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the wreckage of wasted years. All those missed family dinners, all those sacrificed relationships, all those opportunities to make a real difference, traded away for numbers in bank accounts that brought him no joy and served no one. The most painful realization was this. Grace had been in his building for 10 years, creating miracles with limited resources, while he'd been 20 floors above her, hoarding resources that could have funded 1,000 miracles. Monday morning, Richard called Grace directly, not through his assistant, not through building management. He found her personal number and dialed it himself. "Grace, this is Richard Langston. I read the newspaper article about your work in the community. Would you be willing to have lunch with me this week? I have some questions I'd really like to ask you." Grace agreed to meet him Wednesday at a small cafe in her Queens neighborhood, a family-owned place called Maria's Kitchen that served homemade soup and sandwiches for under $10. The choice of location was entirely Grace's, and it was perfect. Richard had eaten at restaurants where single meals cost more than most people's weekly grocery budgets. But sitting across from Grace in a vinyl booth, sharing a turkey sandwich that cost $6.50, he felt more satisfied than he had in years. The cafe was exactly what you'd expect. Mismatched chairs, handwritten menu boards, local customers who greeted each other by name. It was the opposite of Richard's usual environment of expensive restaurants with celebrity chefs and private dining rooms. But the simplicity felt authentic in a way that luxury never had. Grace looked completely at home in this environment, chatting easily with the waitress and waving to regular customers. Richard realized that this was Grace's real world. Not the corporate offices she cleaned, but this community she'd invested in and belonged to. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Richard began. "I have to admit, I'm struggling with some things I learned about your work." Grace smiled knowingly. "You read about the scholarships and the community programs." "I did, and I'm trying to understand something. You built more meaningful impact with limited resources than I've built with billions. How is that possible? If you're starting to see success differently, hit that subscribe button because what Grace told Richard next will reshape how you think about money forever." Grace took a sip of her coffee and looked directly at Richard. "Money is just a tool. What matters is what you do with it." "That sounds simple, but I don't think I really understand what you mean," Richard admitted. "Think about a hammer," Grace said. "You can use a hammer to build a house that shelters a family, or you can use it to tear down a fence that separates neighbors. The hammer itself isn't good or bad. It's just potential energy waiting to be directed." She continued, "Most wealthy people I've observed treat money like a trophy instead of a tool. They accumulate it to prove something to themselves or others. But money sitting in accounts doesn't solve problems. Money in motion solves problems." Richard leaned forward. "So you see wealth differently than most people." "I see the difference between having wealth and creating wealth for others," Grace explained. "When I invest in a young person's education, that investment doesn't disappear. It multiplies. That scholarship recipient becomes a teacher or a nurse or an entrepreneur who creates jobs for others. My money doesn't just get spent. It gets planted. Like seeds in a garden." Richard said, remembering Grace's teaching methods from a newspaper article. Exactly. True wealth multiplies when you give it away strategically. But most people are afraid to plant their seeds because they're too busy counting them. Grace's philosophy was revolutionary to Richard. He'd spent decades trying to maximize his wealth accumulation. Grace had spent the same decades maximizing her wealth distribution, and somehow ended up wealthier in every way that actually mattered. The secret, Grace said quietly, is understanding that real security doesn't come from hoarding resources. It comes from building systems that create resources for everyone. When you lift up your community lifts you up. Richard sat in that modest cafe, eating a simple sandwich, listening to a cleaning lady explain wealth principles that Harvard Business School had never taught him. For the first time in his adult life, he understood what it meant to be truly rich. Walking back to his office after lunch with Grace, Richard felt like he was seeing New York City through completely different eyes. The same streets he'd traveled for years suddenly looked different. He noticed homeless individuals he'd previously walked past without acknowledgement. He saw struggling families in ways he'd never observed before. He recognized opportunity gaps that his wealth could address but never had. The shift happening in Richard's mind was profound. For 3 decades, his internal compass had pointed toward one direction: accumulation. Every business decision, every investment choice, every use of his time had been filtered through a single question: how can this make me wealthier? Now, sitting in his corner office that evening, Richard found himself asking completely different questions. How can my wealth solve problems? What impact could I create if I stopped hoarding and started investing strategically in people? How many Grace Thompsons could I empower if I treated money as a tool instead of a trophy? The disconnect between his resources and his impact became painfully clear. Richard owned art collections worth more than entire school districts' annual budgets. His wine cellar contained bottles that could fund college scholarships. His real estate portfolio included vacation homes he visited once per year while families struggled to afford basic housing. He'd been living in a bubble of luxury while remaining completely disconnected from the human struggles happening just outside his glass towers. Grace had been solving real problems with limited resources, while Richard had been accumulating unlimited resources that solved no problems. That night, Richard made a decision that would transform everything. He called Grace at home. "I want to do more than just understand your philosophy," he told her. "I want to learn how to apply it. Would you be willing to teach me?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "Richard, are you sure you're ready for what that means? Because once you start seeing money as a tool for transformation instead of accumulation, you can't unsee it. Your entire relationship with wealth will change." "I'm ready," Richard said, though he had no idea how drastically those words would reshape his life. 2 weeks later, Richard and Grace sat in the same modest cafe where their first conversation had taken place. But this time, they weren't just talking about philosophy. They were designing something concrete. "I want to create a foundation," Richard announced. "But I don't want to be another wealthy person's tax write-off that accomplishes nothing meaningful. I want it to work the way your programs work, directly, personally, with measurable impact." Grace smiled. Foundations often fail because they're designed by wealthy people for wealthy people. They focus on galas and board meetings instead of actual community needs. So how do we avoid that trap? Richard asked. "We start with the community, not with the money," Grace replied. "We identify real problems, then design solutions that work for the people experiencing those problems. The money comes last, not first." Over the next month, Richard and Grace spent hours together planning what would become the Langston Thompson Foundation. The name itself was symbolic. Richard's resources combined with Grace's wisdom. Corporate power merged with community insight. The partnership was extraordinary to witness. Richard brought financial resources, business connections, and institutional knowledge. Grace brought community relationships, practical experience, and deep understanding of what actually worked to transform lives. 2 worlds that had never intersected were colliding to create something beautiful. The billionaire CEO and the cleaning lady discovered they were perfect complements. Richard had the means to scale Grace's proven methods, while Grace had the knowledge to ensure Richard's resources created real impact instead of just impressive-sounding initiatives. The Foundation's first program was a comprehensive financial literacy initiative designed around Grace's proven teaching methods. But scaling Grace's approach required Richard to completely rethink how educational programs should work. Grace insisted they meet potential students in community centers, libraries, and neighborhood gathering places instead of corporate conference rooms. She taught Richard that effective financial education happened through conversation and relationship building, not lectures and presentations. People don't trust financial advice from someone wearing a $3,000 suit, Grace explained during one of their planning sessions. They trust advice from someone who understands their struggles and has walked in their shoes. The irony was delicious. The billionaire was becoming the student, learning from someone he'd overlooked for a decade. Richard found himself taking notes while Grace explained community dynamics, cultural sensitivity, and the psychology of financial decision-making among people living paycheck to paycheck. Grace taught Richard that successful community programs required patience, consistency, and genuine relationship building. You couldn't just throw money at problems and expect transformation. You had to invest time, attention, and authentic care in individual human beings. Richard discovered that learning to create impact was more challenging and more rewarding than learning to create wealth had ever been. Building businesses required understanding markets, competitors, and profit margins. Building community programs required understanding people, families, and generational patterns of behavior. 6 months after their first lunch conversation, the Langston Thompson Foundation launched its pilot program with 30 students across 3 Queens community centers. Richard insisted on meeting every participant personally, not just signing checks from a distance. Maria Santos was their first scholarship recipient, a single mother of 2 who had been working 3 part-time jobs while taking Grace's financial literacy classes for 18 months. The foundation funded her enrollment in a medical assistant certification program while providing child care support and emergency financial assistance. 8 months later, Maria graduated with certification and immediately found full-time employment with health benefits. Her starting salary was 40% higher than her combined income from 3 part-time jobs. More importantly, she had a career path with growth potential instead of just survival employment. This program didn't just change my income, Maria told Richard during a foundation progress meeting. It changed how my children see their own possibilities. They watch me study. They see me learning new skills. They understand that education opens doors. I'm breaking a cycle that has trapped my family for generations. Stories like Maria's started multiplying. David Chun, a recent high school graduate, used foundation support to attend community college while completing an apprenticeship program. Within 2 years, he was earning enough to help his parents avoid foreclosure on their family home. Jennifer Williams, a grandmother raising her 3 grandchildren, used financial literacy training to start a successful catering business that now employs 4 neighbors and serves local community events. The community response was overwhelming. Word spread through networks Grace had been building for years, but now those networks had access to resources that could transform dreams into realities. Richard began attending graduation ceremonies, community meetings, and family celebrations. For the first time since college, he felt genuinely connected to something larger than his own success. The foundation was working because it combined Grace's community credibility with Richard's institutional resources. Together, they were creating something neither could have built alone, a sustainable system for transforming lives through strategic investment in human potential. But their biggest discoveries were still ahead of them. The transformation happening between Richard and Grace didn't stay contained to their foundation work. Like a stone thrown into still water, their partnership created waves that spread throughout Langston Innovations in ways neither of them had anticipated. It started with small changes. Richard began arriving at the office earlier, not to squeeze in more meetings, but to spend time talking with employees he'd previously only acknowledged in passing. He started eating lunch in the company cafeteria instead of his executive dining room, sitting with different departments and asking questions about their work that went beyond quarterly performance metrics. The cleaning staff noticed the change first. Richard now greeted them by name, asked about their families, and genuinely listened to their responses. Word spread quickly through the building that the CEO was somehow different, more present, more human, more interested in people than just numbers. Department heads started receiving unexpected requests from Richard. Instead of focusing solely on cost reduction and efficiency gains, he began asking about employee development opportunities, community outreach possibilities, and ways the company could create positive impact beyond its immediate business objectives. I want us to think about our responsibility to the communities where we operate. Richard announced during a senior leadership meeting, we're not just extracting value from these areas, we should be contributing value to them. The executive team was initially confused. This wasn't the Richard Langston they'd worked with for years. But as Richard shared stories from the foundation's work and explained the partnership with Grace, something remarkable happened. Other executives began sharing their own ideas about community involvement and social responsibility. Sarah Kim, the head of human resources, proposed creating apprenticeship programs that would train local residents for technical positions within the company. Marcus Rodriguez, the facilities manager, suggested partnering with local contractors and suppliers to ensure company spending benefited neighborhood businesses. The company's mission statement evolved from maximizing shareholder value through innovative technology solutions to creating technology that improves lives while building stronger communities. But the most significant change was cultural. Employees at every level began talking about their work differently. Instead of just completing tasks for paychecks, they started discussing how their roles contributed to broader positive impact. The company culture shifted from purely transactional to genuinely transformational. For Richard, the change was nothing short of revolutionary. The emptiness that had plagued him for years was replaced by a sense of purpose he'd never experienced. Instead of waking up wondering how much money he could make that day, he woke up excited about problems he could solve and lives he could improve. His relationship with money fundamentally changed. Richard still earned substantial income from his business ventures, but money had become a means to an end rather than an end in itself. He found himself evaluating every expense through Grace's lens. Is this accumulation or is this contribution? The anxiety that had haunted Richard's success disappeared. When wealth was just about accumulation, there was never enough. There was always another billion to chase, another competitor to outperform, another milestone that promised but never delivered satisfaction. When wealth became about impact, every dollar deployed effectively brought genuine fulfillment. Grace's transformation was equally profound, though different in nature. The foundation work had given her access to resources that multiplied her impact exponentially. Instead of helping dozens of students through her evening classes, she was now reaching hundreds of families through comprehensive programs. More importantly, Grace had discovered her voice as a leader and educator on a much larger scale. She began speaking at conferences, consulting with other foundations, and mentoring executives who wanted to create meaningful impact with their wealth. The shy cleaning lady who worked quietly in corporate hallways for a decade had emerged as a recognized expert in community-based financial education and wealth redistribution strategies. Both Richard and Grace had found fulfillment in the most unexpected ways. Richard had discovered that true success wasn't measured by personal accumulation, but by collective transformation. Grace had learned that her wisdom and experience had value far beyond her immediate community. The story of Richard and Grace began spreading beyond Langston Innovations, carried by employees, foundation participants, and community members who had witnessed their partnership's impact. How many Grace Thompsons do you walk past every day without noticing? How many people with extraordinary wisdom, untapped potential, and valuable perspectives are invisible to you because of assumptions you make about their jobs, their income, or their circumstances? The question haunted other business leaders who heard about the Langston Thompson Foundation. Richard began receiving calls from CEOs and entrepreneurs who wanted to understand how they could apply similar principles to their own wealth and businesses. A technology executive in San Francisco started meeting regularly with janitors in his building to understand their perspectives on workplace culture and community needs. A real estate developer in Chicago began partnering with neighborhood leaders to ensure new construction projects served existing residents rather than displacing them. The story resonated because it challenged fundamental assumptions about value, worth, and wisdom. Grace's example proved that insight and impact weren't correlated with income or job titles. Richard's transformation demonstrated that true wealth required more than accumulation. It demanded strategic distribution. Local news outlets picked up the story, then national business publications. Harvard Business School invited Richard and Grace to speak to MBA students about alternative approaches to measuring success and creating sustainable impact. The partnership between a billionaire CEO and a cleaning lady had become a model for bridging economic divides and creating collaborative solutions to community challenges. But the most important impact wasn't the media attention or the speaking invitations. It was the hundreds of individuals whose lives had been transformed and who were now transforming others. Their story proved that extraordinary impact was possible when people from different worlds chose to see each other's humanity and combine their unique strengths. So what does it really mean that Grace Thompson was worth more than Richard Langston, the billionaire CEO? It wasn't about the numbers in their bank accounts. Richard's $3.2 billion dwarfed Grace's $1 million portfolio. But worth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lives touched, problems solved, and positive change created in the world. Grace was worth more because her wealth served a higher purpose. Every dollar she earned was a soldier deployed in battles against poverty, ignorance, and hopelessness. Her money worked over time, multiplying impact through strategic investments in human potential. Richard's billions have been sitting idle, growing larger but accomplishing nothing meaningful. His wealth was like a massive reservoir that never flowed into the communities that needed it most. He had accumulated tremendous resources while remaining disconnected from the human struggles happening just outside his glass towers. But here's the beautiful part of this story. Richard's billions became truly meaningful the moment he redirected them toward others. When wealth stopped being about accumulation and started being about transformation, Richard finally discovered what it meant to be genuinely rich. The lesson isn't that money is evil or that wealthy people are inherently selfish. The lesson is that money's value isn't determined by how much you have. It's determined by what you do with what you have. Grace understood this principle intuitively. She measured her success not by her net worth, but by her community's improvement. She invested in people because she knew that human potential, properly supported, generates returns that compound forever. Richard learned that true wealth multiplies when you give it away strategically. Every scholarship funded created a ripple effect of positive change that would impact generations. Every small business loan supported created jobs and opportunities for entire families. Every financial literacy program graduated students who would teach others what they'd learned. Grace had been playing the wealth game correctly all along. She built resources to serve others, while Richard had been building resources to serve only himself. If this story changed how you think about success and wealth, I need you to do 3 things right now. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now you might be thinking, this is inspiring, but I'm not a billionaire. How can I apply Grace's principles to my own life? Here's the powerful truth. Grace's approach works at every income level. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. If you're earning $30,000 per year, you can still mentor someone who's earning $20,000. If you have basic financial literacy, you can teach someone who doesn't. If you've learned from your mistakes, you can help others avoid making the same ones. Grace didn't wait until she had millions to start making a difference. She began with small actions, volunteering at community centers, sharing knowledge with neighbors, investing tiny amounts consistently over time. The secret is shifting your mindset from accumulation to contribution. Instead of asking, how can I get more? Start asking, how can I give more? Instead of measuring success by what you've accumulated, measure it by the positive impact you've created. You don't need Richard's billions to transform lives. You need Grace's philosophy. Treat money as a tool for building something bigger than yourself. Maybe you can fund one scholarship instead of 100. Maybe you can mentor one person instead of teaching entire classes. Maybe you can help one family avoid foreclosure instead of funding community development projects. Scale doesn't matter. Impact matters. What will you do today to build wealth that matters? How will you use whatever resources you have, time, knowledge, money, connections, to create positive change in someone else's life? The partnership between Grace Thompson and Richard Langston proved that extraordinary transformation happens when people from different worlds choose to see each other's value and combine their unique strengths. Their foundation continued growing, their impact kept expanding, and their story kept inspiring others to rethink the relationship between wealth and worth. But Grace and Richard's story doesn't end here, because what happened next shocked even them. When other billionaires started reaching out, wanted to replicate their model, Grace and Richard discovered something about wealth and power that neither of them had expected. Something that would test everything they built together and force them to make a choice that would define not just their legacy, but the future of wealth redistribution in America. That's a story for next week. Until then, remember, your worth isn't measured by what you've accumulated. It's measured by what you've contributed. Now, go build wealth that matters. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this extraordinary story here on Soul Igniting Story. I truly appreciate you for taking the time to be with us, to open your heart, and to let these words spark something within your soul. Every story we share is crafted to inspire, to uplift, and to remind us all that love, hope, and resilience are alive in every corner of the world. If this story touched you, made you smile, or even brought a little spark of wonder to your day, I would be so grateful if you could show your support. Please give this video a like. It helps more souls discover these stories. Don't forget to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, feelings, or even your own experiences connected to the story. Your words make this community come alive. And of course, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next beautiful journey we'll be sharing together. Until next time, thank you again for being part of the Soul Igniting Story family, where every story lights a flame within.